Welcome to this Facebook Live Wednesday Stash, where I share ways to help you keep your food for longer. Oh. Okay, so we're going to talk about your home food preservation options. You've got a few of them. So while it is definitely a blessing to have fresh food on hand, everybody, that's like the gold standard, as fresh as possible. It's a blessing to have preserved food on hand as well. There might be times where fresh food is out of reach, it's not accessible. So it's nice and critical, to have food on hand when you don't have fresh options. Preserved foods also, they enhance the flavor of food. So you might have one food that once it's preserved, it's going to take on different flavor, a different texture, different aromas. Their preservation changes food in very beneficial ways. So fresh is wonderful, it's good. Preserved foods, they're good as well. If you think about preserved foods enhancing fresh foods, you might have something where you made a fresh dish. Maybe it might be potato salad, but you've added a preserved food like pickles to it. That's going to enhance that potato salad, makes it taste better. It's good. And then, like I said, it offers the complexity of flavors and textures that a lot of people find very, very enjoyable and beneficial. So you think about how people use preserved foods. You also think about not only how you prepare them, how you use them, but you think about some of the functionality of giving them as gifts. You think about someone who brings, say, jerky along on a camping trip. That makes that camping trip, that much more special. Not only does it provide sustenance on the trip, you have light, easy, portable to carry food that will give you energy while you're on the trip. You think about if somebody brought a homemade jerky with it, it's going to make that time together that much more special beyond just being able to eat the food. It's the same thing if somebody brings, say, a preserve or a jelly to a brunch. It makes it, that much more special to have something like that along to bring along with you. So you can make things like these to use and consume at home or to give away as gifts. Now, the reason that you have to preserve food is because they're part of nature. As soon as something is slaughtered or harvested, it does what? It starts to decay, it starts to break down, it starts to spoil. That's the cycle, that's the nature of things. So what preservation does is it puts that on hold. Well, some areas it puts it on hold, others it delays it, others it changes it. It changes it into something that you can keep a lot longer. So it's going to depend on the type of food preservation method that we're talking about. So every culture has a food preservation method out of necessity. This came about before there was refrigeration, before there was a way to put food on hold. Every culture came up with a way to do this. And climate was a huge factor in the preferred method to preserve food. So you had some cultures where freezing was the best way to keep it, because if you thought about the climate, that was the climate. Other cultures, drying was the best way. Other cultures, fermenting. Depended on where that food preservation method developed. Climate's going to be a huge factor in what developed, what happened. So we're going to talk about some home food preservation methods that you might be really familiar with, others, and you do all the time, and it's not a big deal. And we're going to talk about some that you might not be so familiar with, and you might want to try. So we're going to start off with the simplest, the easiest, the quickest, all of that, freezing. So what freezing? Freezing preserves food by preventing the growth of microbes that cause spoilage and or foodborne illness. Freezing makes water unavailable. So when you have more water in the food, when it's in the form of an ice crystal, microbes can't use that ice crystal. So that prevents the food from spoiling. Um, Freezing doesn't kill. That's something to keep in mind. Freezing doesn't kill microbes. It'll stop them. If you have a frozen food and it has foodborne illness or spoilage microorganisms there, freezing is going to put them, it's going to stop them, but not kill them. So as soon as that food is defrosted, guess what? It's going to start right back up. As soon as that water is available for growth, that's what it's going to do. It's going to start growing again. So you need to keep that in mind. Frozen food needs to be handled carefully. You want to make sure when you're freezing it that you're doing everything is clean, your hands are clean, equipment, everything is clean in that process, because you don't want to introduce anything to the food, additionally that's not there, not already there naturally. So you want to keep everything as clean as possible. And then after the food has been defrosted, or in the process of defrosting, so that you're getting ready to use it, you want to handle that food carefully. You don't want to introduce anything. You don't want cross-contamination. You don't want to introduce anything that can grow and potentially make you sick, or potentially spoil the food, cause the food to go bad. So handle frozen food carefully. Now, all flavors of frozen food are caused by rancidity of the fat, which can occur when the fat is exposed to oxygen. So part of freezing is freezing in the right container. What you want to do, or containers, what you want to do is you want to block out as much oxygen as possible to reduce the chance of oxidation, of rancidity or oxidation occurring in the food. So one of the things that you want to do is, like I said, use the proper materials, and there's all kinds of things that are available. There's freezer wrap. So the difference between freezer wrap and regular plastic wrap, freezer wrap is going to block out, it's going to prevent oxygen exposure. It's going to trap moisture. This way you're avoiding freezer burn. The dehydration that's going to naturally occur in your freezer. Well, if you have your food wrapped in a freezer, in a container appropriate for freezing, you're going to trap that moisture in, and you don't wind up with dried out, dehydrated food, or in this portions of the food that are dried out, because the moisture has escaped. So you want to use things like, you want to use a freezer wrap, freezer paper. With freezer paper, you're going to have where it's paper, your wrap paper on one side, but this side of it, I don't know if you can see that shining, there's a moisture barrier. And what that moisture barrier does is it keeps that moisture in, it traps it. So this is the side that you would actually want to be the food wrapped in this side. You want to wrap it up, and you want to press out as much air as possible so that you can keep that moisture in, as well as label so that you know that what's in here. You'll see this at the time when you do it. You might say, oh, I know what I just wrapped up, and then later when it's in the freezer, what is it? What in the world? So that's why once you've wrapped it well, you've pressed out all of the air, you put a label and a date on it, because the quality over time with freezing goes down. You can freeze indefinitely. It can stay in the freezer as long as your freezer is operating 0 degrees or lower. As long as it's keeping that food frozen, you can keep it in the freezer indefinitely. But over time, you're going to lose quality. Not safety, you're going to lose quality. So that's why you want to use it within a timely fashion. Put a date on it so that the things that you're putting in first, that's what you're pulling out of the freezer first, instead of having food that's just staying in there for, longer than you want to take it out and consume it. So freezer paper is another option. Heavy duty aluminum foil. Aluminum foil does the same thing and you want heavy duty aluminum foil where you're going to wrap the food, press the air out, and then the nice thing about aluminum foil is it holds itself closed. This is going to need some tape to hold it closed. This is not going to need freezer tape. And you want to use freezer tape because freezer tape will not pop back open in the freezer once it starts solidifying. So use a freezer tape to keep it closed. But with this, the aluminum foil is going to hold itself closed. So you're going to press out all of the air, roll it up. You still want to put a label on it. You still want to put a date. Other options are freezer bags. These are really easy to use. They're great. You can see the contents, which super helpful. But again, you have a little section on it. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, but markers write on this plastic quite well. Put a date, label it, contents, and the date that you've done it. And that's a good way that's the best way to store your frozen foods. And you also have freezer containers like this. This one has that little burpee thing on it. I think it's more for because you can use this in the microwave too, so you can allow steam to vent out. But when you're filling up your containers such as this, you want to fill it up, leave enough headspace so that once it's frozen, it's not going to pop your seal. Foods expand when they're frozen. So you don't want that to happen. You want to fill it up, leave yourself about a ½ inch of headspace for an expansion. But you do want to block out as much air as possible. So with blocking that air out, some of the things that you can do, you can use wax paper, you can use plastic wrap, and you put the food in, and you can use that to displace air. You can put, especially foods that are in liquids, you can use that to displace air. So I'm going to put these out of the way, and we can move on to some other foods, some other forms. Okay, so we've gone through freezer. Oh, I'll give you some freezing tips. You're going to freeze or store frozen meat, fish, or poultry promptly after purchase. You don't want to keep them around for a long time. So instead of putting them in the, purchasing them, sticking them in the refrigerator for a few days before you get to freezing them, you want to do it as promptly as possible. Once you've purchased it, go ahead and divide it. If it turns out that you have purchased big portions and you want to cut them down, and reducing the size will be very, very helpful, you'll find, when it comes to defrosting the food. So it's a lot easier, a lot quicker to defrost food that has been cut down from a large portion instead of wrapping very large portions and freezing them. You think about the difference between a turkey defrosting and a chicken defrosting. Chicken's going to defrost a whole lot quicker than the turkey will. Okay, so you also want to make sure your hands are clean, your preparation areas are clean, all of that. Cleanliness is really important. Your utensils, those are all going to be important when it comes to freezing. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about with home food preservation is drying. Okay, so I have just a couple here. I love drying as a home food preservation method is an awesome method. It takes up so little space and it's very, very light. Okay, so it's just a really, really neat way to preserve food. So here I have some dried herbs. We had a garden last summer, last growing season, and towards the end of the season, our herbs kind of just went insane, and I just did not want them to die out there. So there were some that I gathered and I went ahead and dried. So this is one. I have a few different herbs in there. This is some basil that I dried. And then also I dried bunches and bunches of pumpkin seeds. And that's because, I was trying to use when I was doing dehydration, I dehydrated pumpkin also. We don't have any of that. Our dehydrated food goes very, very quickly. So it's like almost as fast as you dehydrate it, we wind up using it, so we don't keep it around. So all of the pumpkin we dehydrated, that's gone. The pears we dehydrated, all of that is gone. But we still have pumpkin seeds left. Nice snack. I enjoy them. You can use them as a snack. I haven't come up with any. You might have some ways that maybe you could think of using dried pumpkin seeds, but that's mostly what we use them for, is a snack. So with drying, vegetables and fruits have been dried from the earliest times. Leaving it in the sun to dry. Romans loved dried fruit. Any dried fruit they could get their hands on. That was really, really popular. But what drying does is, drying preserves food by robbing microbes of yeast, mold, and bacteria, because the things that feed the yeast, the mold, and the bacteria, especially when it comes to, when you think about like your fruits and such, they need water. So with dehydration, what you're doing, you're removing that water. If you remove the water, yeast, bacteria, microbes, they can't grow. So freezing is not removing the water, you're putting the water on hold, so to speak. When you are drying, you're removing that water, so again, it doesn't have it to grow. Drying also preserves food by slowing down the activity of enzymes. So what enzymes do is, enzymes cause things to happen. And the thing that they're causing to happen is they're initiating, or they're causing foods to decay, to break down back into soil. And when you dehydrate, you put those, you inactivate those enzymes. So that's another thing, another reason, another way that dehydration works. Now, enzymes are naturally occurring. So they help foods, they help them grow and mature. But if they're left, when you get past the growing and maturing, what do? You start going into the dying, the breaking down portion. So if they're not inactivated, you're going to have decomposition, and you're going to have rotting. And with the enzyme activity, that's more the case with vegetables. And fruits have a higher level of sugar and a higher level of acid that helps counteract that. So you're going to have more of that enzyme activity with your vegetables, which is a reason why you might notice, back when we discussed specifically for freezing, one of the things that you do for vegetables before you freeze them is you blanch them. And the reason you're blanching them is because while freezing will, safely store foods indefinitely, does not stop enzymatic activity. The enzymes they're still going, albeit more slowly. They're still acting on the food. So by blanching first and then you freeze, you wind up with a much higher quality food. Still safe, it's safe, you froze it, but your quality will be much higher. Now, some of the different ways that you can dehydrate. Foods can be dried in the sun, they can be dried on the vine, in the oven, or by using an electric dehydrator. If you live in a high humidity state, I'm in North Carolina, our average humidity is 70%. So sun drying is not it's not even a good option for us. Vine drying can even be a little bit of hit or miss, and that's because of our humidity. Because when you're drying in the sun, when you're drying outside, what you want hot, you want the heat of the sun, but you also want the low humidity so the water can evaporate off of the food. You can have really hot temperatures with the moisture not going anywhere. So with trying to sun dry in North Carolina, instead of getting sun dried, the food spoils before it ever gets a chance to dry. Now in the oven, Oven drying is like that could be a nice introduction to dehydrating, but there's a few caveats. Modern ovens, the lowest temperature is usually 170 degrees. When you're dehydrating food, you're not cooking it, you're dehydrating it. You do that at 140 degrees. So if you're using an oven that's maintaining 170, you're actually cooking food that's going to throw you into a whole nother, area. You can dehydrate carrots at 140 degrees and remove all the moisture, put them in a bag, and store them in the cabinet. But if you cook carrots, you don't store cooked carrots in the cabinet. Where do you store them? In the refrigerator. So you want to make sure that you're truly dehydrating the food, and you're not doing it at such temperatures. You could dry the food out at 170 degrees, but you're going to wind up with a very, very different product than something that you have dried at 140. You Oven is the high chance of burning the food, or you have by the time you have the inside part dried sufficiently for storage, the outside has just been, sent to a crisp. So it's tricky with dehydrating in the oven. Also, it uses a lot of energy. To do it takes a long time in the oven, and it uses a lot of energy. In order to maintain that temperature, you may have to prop the oven door open in order for the food to dehydrate satisfactorily. But in the meantime, you're using a lot of, depending on what you're heating, whether you're heating with electric or if you're heating with gas, you're using a lot of energy in order to do it. And then depending on the time of year, you probably do not want to dry food in the oven in the summertime and the oven door is propped open. So that leads us up to dehydrating an electric dehydrator, which is really it's the easiest way. It's very, very efficient, and it doesn't use a lot of energy. You have the cost, the input of getting that equipment to begin with, but once you have that equipment, like I said, it's easy to use. You want to look for a food dehydrator that has a thermostat, has thermostatic control to it, and one that has ventilation, has a fan that's going to cycle on, that's going to cycle off. And the reason why, that allows the drying to happen in a very efficient manner, so you don't have it dry so fast on the outside that moisture is trapped inside, and eventually that's going to lead to rot or spoilage. What you're going to, with the fan circulating, is as the fan circulates, water evaporates off, the fan goes off, it starts drying again, the fan comes back on. It's continual. The fan comes on and it removes that moisture that's coming, that might be escaping from the inside, and helping to avoid case hardening, where you have the fan that's going all the time, all the time, all the time. It's completely dry on the outside, but it's not dry. There's still moisture trapped in the inside. So look for a dehydrator that has both a thermostat, so you can control the temperature, and then it also has a fan. So and there's all different types out there. I can't say that there's one best dehydrator. Get the one that suits your needs, and be careful of buying one that's so big that you'd be surprised how much food can fit into a food dehydrator. So shop for what will work for you and explore your options. And then once you get one, follow the manufacturer's directions for use. Now, fermenting, where fermenting was discovered. Somebody saw something that happened and say, hey, what was that? So somebody noticed that certain leftover foods, when they were left, they didn't rot, but they transformed into something different, something rather delicious, that lasted for a little while, that had a longer storage life. Fermentation increases the nutrition of some foods because it makes nutrients more available than otherwise. Perfect example of this would be the vitamin C that's in cabbage. Cabbage has vitamin C, but when you ferment cabbage, and turn it into sauerkraut, transform it into sauerkraut, that vitamin C is readily available um, for absorption. So not only do you get something that's delicious, you get something that it's good, it's very good for you as well. The microbes, also microbes responsible for fermentation also can produce vitamins while they're fermenting. But you shouldn't choose hit or miss options for fermenting food. You want to choose a tested recipe. So I have So Easy to Preserve. This is one of my favorite books. This comes out of University of Georgia. But tested recipes are recipes that have been tried to see, okay, can this be, this is a safe method to do it, and you're going to wind up with a high quality product, because you want both. You both want something that's safe to eat and something that's good to eat. And with tested recipes, you can achieve that. The only fermented food I have here, I did not ferment this. I ferment kimchi. I love kimchi, but we ate it all, and I have not gone through all the steps. So I've purchased some kimchi because I do a kimchi soup that we love, and it's a really quick dish. So I like to keep it on hand for when I want to make it. But ferments are something that, if you're going to do this at home, use a tested recipe to make it. You can make it. Not all foods are appropriate. If you'll notice, this kimchi, I fermented, but I didn't ferment. I mean, it's fermented, but it's stored in the refrigerator, because kimchi is one of those foods where it's not something that, you can't can it and stick it up in the cabinet. Okay? Whereas with sauerkraut, you can ferment sauerkraut when it's completely finished. You have it tasting, where you want it. That can go into, you can it, and that can go into the cabinet. But this is the type of thing that it stays in the refrigerator. So don't use hit or miss recipes. Some foods require, for the fermentation, they require salt in a specific amount. So you can't say, oh, well, that's just too much salt, I'm going to cut back, because you're trying to select for microbes that are going to, you want select microbes that are for the fermenting that particular food. So if you don't use the proper amount of salt, you're not going to be selecting for the proper amount of the proper type of microbe, and you have something else growing in your ferment that you don't want growing in your ferment. So there are certain ingredients in your fermentation you do not want to, you don't want to make adjustments for that. And then also, ferments, sauerkraut, fermented pickles, they need salt. You have other ferments that require a culture, and you think about yogurt. Yogurt requires a culture in order to make culture the milk and transform it into yogurt. Or if you're working with something like kombucha needs a culture. I'm thinking of some other foods that you can ferment. Kimchi, we're going to use salt for the ferment for that. It's missing. I know there's other foods that other examples, but some foods need a culture, and then temperature becomes very, very important with making sauerkraut and making kimchi. Perfect temperatures for that are going to be about room temperature, between 50 and 70 degrees. Below 50 degrees, it will still ferment, but it's going to slow things down tremendously. When you go above 70 degrees, the fermentation occurs more quickly, and once you get above 80-85 degrees, anything could happen, and I don't mean that in a good way, that the fermentation is occurring so quickly that you're not fermenting what you want, because the temperature is not for that those select microbes that you're looking for. So you want to do this in a controlled temperature. So you're going to look at your ingredients, you're going to look at your temperature. Again, cleanliness is critical. You don't want to put things in there that might be opportunistic. and they want to consume that food so that they can grow. You want to control what's going on in there. So you following a tested recipe like it's something that's so easy to preserve, or National Center for Home Food Preservation, they have tested recipes as well. And this way you can be assured that you're making something that's both safe and you're going to wind up with something that's of high quality. Next one, so we're going to move from, we did drying and we did dehydrating, so we're going to move those over there. We spoke about fermenting. Now we're going to talk about pickling. So the only ones, I pulled out this particular one. I left my other pickles in there, but this is pickled okra, and I pulled this out because we're going to talk about pickled okra some more a little bit later. But with this one, pickling preserves foods in vinegar or another acid. So vinegar is produced from sugars, starches or sugars, fermented first to alcohol, and then the alcohol is oxidized by certain bacteria into acetic acid. So wines, beers, and ciders are all routinely transformed into vinegars. So this was probably another discovered one as well. Maybe somebody, food was placed into wine or beer, and it both preserved the food, and since they both of those have a low pH, but it both preserved the food, and somebody tasted it and said, hey, wait a minute, that's pretty good. So we don't know. Maybe the wine or beer went sour and the taste of food, like, yeah, I like this. But however it happened, pickles are one of the most popular foods. Everybody loves pickles. So again, with pickles, you want to follow a tested recipe. So with ferments, you have to make sure that you're using the right amount of ingredients, and salt being one of the most important. For pickles, the most important ingredient, one of the most important ingredients, is going to be vinegar. You want to use the proper strength of vinegar. Tested recipes ask for 5%, so you want to make sure that you're using a 5% vinegar. Be careful that you don't grab, there's a 4% vinegar in stores that people use to make salad dressing. And it's great for salad dressing. It's not as acidic, it's not, as sharp, because it's lower. It's 4% instead of 5%. And while that's great for salad dressing, that's not what you want to use for a pickle. Nobody wants a squishy or floppy, swollen, otherwise yucky, nasty pickle because you didn't use the proper amount of vinegar to preserve the pickle. So you had, those microbes, they're not controlled, and you have the ones that are in there, that want to either cause food spoilage, they want to break down the food. You're not controlling for any of that when you don't use the proper amount of vinegar. So follow a tested recipe, okay, for making pickles. Next, like I said, I'm going to keep this aside because we're going to talk about okra again. Next, we're going to talk about jams and jellies. Okay, so you cook fruit with sugar, and how could that not be popular? So what the sugar does is the sugar is going to preserve the fruit, and preserving fruit with honey has been done, it was known to some of the earliest cultures with using honey or sugar to preserve fruit. And in ancient Greece, quince was mixed with honey, dried somewhat, and packed tightly into jars. So that's how they saved quince. The Romans improved the method. They cooked the quince and the honey, and they produced a solid texture. They figured out how to make a gel. That's basically what happened, because when you get a gel, it's not syrup. When you get a gel, it's going to be the proper amount of sugar, acid, and pectin. That's how you get a gel. So if you've made a jam or jelly and it's syrup in there, something in your ratio was off. Okay? So what sugar does is it binds the water. Sugar is your preservative. So it binds the water that otherwise would be available to microbes to cause spoilage. And with the combination of the lower pH of most fruits, that preserves it. Now, I have this one is a hot pepper jelly. Okay, but this one is a pear butter. Jams, jellies, preserves, conserves, marmalades, and butters, they're sweet spreads. They're in the category of sweet spreads, but they all individually mean something. So that's worth investigating. That's something that you want to look up. Okay, why is a jelly called a jelly? Why is a jam called a jam? Why is a marmalade called a marmalade, a conserve? Go ahead and check those out, and they each have a specific definition. So that would be fun, something fun to explore if you don't already know the answers to those questions. Okay. Now these were already canned, but I wanted to speak specifically about canning. So I have a bunch of canned food. I have some canned green beans. I have some carrots. I have some beef, chicken. Oh, let's see if I'm trying to organize and see how you can see all this. I've got some chicken, and I have some, let's put that right there. I have some pears. All right. Here's my lineup. Oh, you get in front. There you go. So these are canned foods. Okay, so with canning is the process in which foods are placed into jars or cans, because you buy canned food at the supermarket, and heated to a temperature that destroys microorganisms, and it inactivates enzymes. This heating and cooling, that's how your seal, that's how your vacuum is formed, where the food inside the jars has been heated to the necessary temperature and then allowed to cool down. You have a vacuum sealing, because during the processing, the air is pushed out of the jar, but once it seals, the oxygen is pushed out of the jar. The seal prevents it from returning inside, into the jar. So, and it keeps it from recontaminating. You know, your food is good. It's in here. It's stored. You don't want anything to get back in there. So canning is the newest addition to the history of food preservation. It was pioneered by Nicholas Appert. There's a really neat video on the website if you look for it. The history of canning. It's a little animation that's really fun. But he was a French confectioner in 1790s. He discovered that the application of heat to food in sealed glass bottles preserved the food from deterioration. Louis Pasteur discovered the relationship between microorganisms and food spoilage and foodborne illness in 1864. But just prior to Pasteur's discovery, Raymond Chevalier Appert patented the pressure retort. It's a type of canner in 1851 to can at temperatures higher than 212 degrees Fahrenheit. 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Because with these pears are going to be processed in a boiling water canner. Water boils at 212, up to 1,000 foot. If you're at sea level, up to 1,000 foot, you're going to have 212 degrees. Well, he discovered how to do it at temperatures higher than that. But it wasn't until the 1920s where this method of canning at higher than 212 was known. They found out the relationship between that and controlling for Clostridium botulinum toxins. The toxin that causes botulism, that comes from Clostridium botulinum spores. Well, they didn't figure that out until about the 1920s, and that's why foods like pears and even my pickled okra. Let's see, too close. Pears and the pickled okra, they can go into a boiling water canner. But beef, carrots, green beans, chicken, they all have to be, put that back here, they all have to be pressure canned, okay? Because 212 degrees is not going to control, is not going to destroy the spores, Clostridium botulinum spores. And once those spores become vegetative, they produce the toxin that causes botulism. So canning extends the shelf life of fresh foods, and it can further extend the shelf life of fermented and pickled foods. So the pickled okra, it's going to have a longer storage life than fresh okra, but once it's canned, it's going to have an even longer shelf life. Okay, but like I said before, you want to make sure you're using a tested recipe. That's going to a tested recipe is also going to give you the specific processing method. It's going to tell you whether or not you can boiling water bath foods such as these, or if you need to pressure can foods such as these. Your tested recipe will tell you that. Not only will it tell you that, it will tell you the specific size jar you can be using. Sometimes you can use a quart jar. Sometimes you're limited to a pint jar. You might be canning something in quart jars and think that you're completely fine, and actually you shouldn't be canning anything larger than the pint jar. That's going to be in your tested recipe. So that's why when you have a tested recipe, you want to go ahead, don't skip steps, don't change anything, you just want to follow the recipe. You've had people who have canned these low acid foods that need to be pressure canned with the same methods that they use for higher acid and acidified foods, and people have become ill. There was someone who, I spoke about this last week, where someone received a gift of carrots, canned carrots, and they thought something was wrong when they tasted. They spit it out. The person still became ill from still got botulism, but the person who gifted them the carrots, boiling water canned the carrots, did not understand that the carrots needed to be pressure canned, because they boiling water canned other things, and if they made something like pears or apples or any other type of fruit, higher acid or acidified food, they're fine. But for the low acid, they didn't understand the association, the connection between proper processing method specific for the food. So the tested recipe will tell you that. It will tell you the amount of time it needs to be processed in addition to the processing method. It will tell you the adjustments to make for altitude, because I'm at, I think I'm guessing, but I think I'm at about 38, 39, foot above sea level. I'm fine to can these foods. I use a weighted gauge canner at 10 pounds of pressure. But if I were in the mountains, I would have to make adjustments depending on what my altitude is. And that's important information to know when it comes to canning. So when you're also canning, make sure that you're using canning jars. These were designed to stand up to the rigors of canning. You might be tempted to use commercial jars that were empty. The glass looks perfectly good. There's a couple of things. They're prone to bit breakage, and then also they usually have a beveled, the top of the jar, the lid is not the lid, the rim of the jar is beveled instead of flat, so they don't take a canning lid very well, and you're at risk of not getting a good seal or not sealing at all. When you can, you want to have a really good seal, good vacuum. Good vacuum tells you that you have expressed the air from this jar. Air has been pulled from the jar and the jar is sealed. And that's what you want. You want a good vacuum when you're canning. Okay? So we've covered a lot. I've talked about lids, proper lids and bands. There's other videos about that. So there's one recommended type of lid and band for canning jars. That's the 2-piece metal. There's videos in there you can look up and see why do we say there's only one recommended type. But go ahead and look up for lids as well. Like I said, we've covered a lot, but in honor of Black History Month, that's why I kept my okra. See, let's move that back so you can see the okra. Oh, this is my favorite way. Pickled okra, so good. Good stuff. So I want to focus on the okra. Now, it's not a favorite of everyone. Not everybody loves okra. There are actually people who think okra is slimy. I can't imagine. But it's delicious. Now you can roast it. Another wonderful way to have it. There's a recipe that I love: okra, corn, and tomatoes. Oh, that's so good. Yummy stuff too. But dried is nice if you've never had dried okra. That's a really nice way to have okra as well. But my favorite is the pickle. They make fabulous pickles. I like pickled cucumber, but if I had to choose between pickled cucumbers and pickled okra, I'm going to choose pickled okra. Now, okra comes from the hibiscus family. It has a gorgeous blossom. If you've ever grown okra, you know that, or if you've ever seen okra growing, you know it has a really beautiful blossom. Now, okra originated in Africa. Black people brought to the Americas via the transatlantic slave trade brought okra seeds with them and purposefully placed in their hair for the journey. So that you didn't know where you were going, but you would have food. You knew how to plant food. Once you got there, you knew you had something that was familiar to you to eat. People brought from Angola, they called okra nagumbo. Nagumbo meant vegetable, but they called it nagumbo, which eventually became gumbo. Now, if you think about the dish gumbo, okra is the star of that dish. You can't make gumbo without okra. And you can find, if you are interested in making pickled okra, hope you are, you can find a recipe for pickled okra at the National Center for Home Food Preservation. There are other canning guides. They have a recipe for pickled okra also. So I would encourage you to make some pickled okra. Now, if we have okra lovers out there, if you would please drop your comments. What is your favorite way to eat okra? Have you ever pickled okra before? Have you ever canned okra? But drop all of that in the comments. And that's what drop in what is your favorite way to eat okra. And that's it for this week's Wednesday Stash. Next week, I'm going to start talking about we're getting ready to go into canning season. This is the last week of February. We're going into March. People are starting to prepare for the growing season. So I'm going to talk about what do you need to do to prepare for canning season. But that's it for this week's Wednesday Stash. If you like the video, please press that like button and follow us so that you can get the alerts of when we put videos up. And thank you for joining me this week's Wednesday Stash.